Bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite, or whatever the case may be. My name is Marcus, and I am the host of the Black Brazil Today YouTube channel, as well as the blackbraziltoday.com blog, where I analyze Brazil from the perspective of race. So today's topic is something that I will bring up from time to time. It's because it's just something that needs to be talked about. It's something that's really important when we talk about this, what I've referred to as a racial hierarchy in Brazil, for a number of years now. It's because of how, in the minds of many Brazilians, perhaps the majority, there's a clear ideal of who are the better people in Brazil. It's a clear conception in the minds of many people who are the people that are the most attractive, that are most intelligent, they're the richest people. They look at different groups as this is the team you want to belong to, and this is the team you want to avoid. And speaking of in terms of race and color, it's obvious that the Brazilian population has been manipulated into believing that the closer you are to the European phenotype, the better your life is going to be, the more accepted you're going to be. And and it's not divided by color. It's saying that the population as a whole in general sees it this way. It's only been, I would say, in the last 10 to 15 years where Black Brazilians are starting to push back against this narrative. But this is the one that's been in place for decades and arguably centuries in Brazil, going all the way back to the 1500s when they started importing enslaved Africans, for labor in the land that will become known as the Federative Republic of Brazil. So this is something that Black Americans have gone through, and we're seeing this struggle going on in Black Brazil as well, where you cannot change the perception of the nation in terms of who you are and people who look like you until you're able to influence how these narratives are presented. Until Black Brazilians are able to have more influence, say in academia, have more access to the writing literature, being some of the people who are behind the cameras in the media as well as in front of the cameras, then these narratives about this group is great and this group not so great, it's going to remain that way until Black people have more control over these narratives and how they influence other people. So I found a good example of this in a post by this Instagram channel that I've been following for a while. This is another example of there's so much information that comes out, so many good things to talk about, so many controversial things to talk about. It's like sometimes, I get a hold of a story and it's like I don't have a chance to get to it immediately. So I'll just put it in my archives and say, okay, one day I'm going to get to that story. So for this particular story, I'm going to share this one today, even though I think I saved this story maybe a couple of months ago. But the IG channel, the Instagram channel is called Revista Ebano, and it's run by a young lady who calls herself Luana Safire. I think that's how she pronounces it, Safiri or Safir. And she was going back in her life to remember something that happened to her when she was like in the sixth grade. And as persons of African descent, I'm quite sure there's probably a lot of us who can relate to this story. So what she's saying is that it was an interaction she had with her teacher at the time. And she had to, basically check this teacher on something that he was saying in front of the class. She says, look, we are descendants of Egyptian kings and queens. Remembering that time when I checked my history teacher over his depiction of Black people. How many of us who've been in just traditional schools can remember having an incident like this? A number of my friends, when we have these conversations, will point to some incident that they can remember going back in school where they had a white teacher who was talking about something in history and the negative connotations they associated with Black people. I know a lot of us, most of us, in fact, under the school systems that we went to, we probably never learned nothing about the rich history of like pre-colonial Africa. How many of you can say honestly that whether you were in middle school, elementary school, high school, or even college, when can you remember your professor or your teacher ever telling you something about the greatness of the African continent and its history? Just think about that for a minute, because this is what I'm talking about today. So before I get into this video, definitely take a moment, only take a second, click on click on the like button, make sure you like the video, share the video, consider subscribing to this channel, and click on the notification bell so you know every time I put up a new video. So let's get into this video for today, because I think it's intriguing. It's a lot of things I want to bring to the fore, because the history of Africans and Black people is not something that's just people in the United States should be aware of. I mean, as this so-called slave trade happened throughout the Americas and involved several African nations and European nations, this is information that everybody should know. And I'm not even saying this should just stop with just persons of visible African ancestry should know this. It's like, no. One of the main reasons why we continue to be disrespected on a global level is because the history of Africa and its people has been covered up and hidden for decades now. Okay. There's something that has to be addressed. And if we don't talk about it, this is information that our kids will never get, because we can't count on a Eurocentric school system to teach our kids this information. I know going through high school and college, this is not stuff that I knew about. I had to learn some of this stuff on my own. So anyway, with that said, I want to get directly into this video and just talk about what this young lady had to say. So this is Luana Safire. I think that's how she says it. You look at it and it just says Safire or Sapphire. I'm not sure, because whenever we pronounce words in English and then it gets to another country, people pronounce it in the way that they would pronounce it. So again, today, the video is called "We Are Descendants of Egyptian Kings and Queens, Remembering That Time When I Checked My History Teacher Over His Depiction of Black People." As I've said, Blacks and Africans are, and for the most part, invisible in school textbooks. I remember even when I was taking college courses, the only time Black people would come up is when it was, Martin Luther King. They talked about the civil rights movement. In general, that's all you really heard. And that was generally a small topic. They talk a little bit about Martin Luther King, a little bit about the civil rights movement, and then it was on to the next topic. Now, when I went to a community college in Detroit, some years ago, some of those classes were more on the we'll say Afrocentric side, and they wanted to present things that they knew we would not get if we were to go to another college, because this is not talked about in most colleges and universities. Okay. In the media, Africa is always shown as a place of poverty, disease, backwardness. Every time the mainstream media wants to show Africa, they show poor people, they show poor kids, they got protruding bellies, they'll have flies on their faces. They always show Africa as a place of misery, but why don't they ever show some of the great cities that you have throughout Africa? When you see some of the metropolitan cities in Africa, you have to ask. You can just pull up a Google image right now and just say, well, why don't you show these images of Nigeria, these images of South Africa, these images of Senegal, these images of Zimbabwe? You're going to see great metropolitan cities as you would find in Europe. Now, you look in Europe, when was the last time when you ever saw France or London or Berlin, countries in Scandinavia, whatever? When did they ever show Europeans in poverty? I'm not saying it's never happened, because, I don't spend a lot of time watching TV, but in general, in your recollection, when do they show misery and poverty in Europe? Because you do have poor people, poor communities, poor cities in Europe, but they never show that on TV. They choose to show that when they want to depict Africa. Think about that for a minute. What effect does that have on the psyche when you see one continent portrayed one way and another continent portrayed the other way? Throughout history, in our history textbooks, documentaries, TV series, Africans and Black people are consistently just shown as slaves. I've talked about how in Brazil, to this day, the Brazilian television networks will continue to show soap operas, which they call novellas, where they're set in the slavery era. And you'll watch that and you'll see Black people being humiliated in slavery. You see them being tied to a post and being whipped. What does that do to the psyche of a small child when that's all they see? When we see the people presented as superior being one color and inferior in the other color? What is that? How does that affect a Black child growing up? Especially when we talk about in Brazil, many persons of visible African ancestry do not define themselves as Black. And one of the main reasons is because how Black people are depicted in the media. How would you feel if that's all you saw, the people who look like you? Of course, you want to avoid being associated with that image because of the way it makes you feel. Documentaries and books never show the great contributions of the African continent to humanity. Now, one thing, I'm going to just present a few facts. These are just a few. With the advent of the internet, this is something that you can find for yourself because this is something, you know, when I started going to college and even before, this was some research that I did on my own. It's like, wow, there's a whole history of a continent that I didn't know anything about because the powers that be didn't want me to know that history or anybody else in the world to know that history. So it's okay that we learn about the history of Europe, the history of India, the history of China, the history of Australia. All of these places you can learn a little bit about, but why is it that African history is always so hidden? So then when you present some of this history to people, they've been so indoctrinated to believe that history of Africa is just misery and depression. You present these facts that have been, proven over and over again, like these are the facts, and people refuse to believe it. Like, nah, Africans couldn't have done that. To the point where we know the ongoing debate, where people want to take Egypt out of Africa. They want to look at modern day Egypt and see the people who are Egyptians today and think those are the same Egyptians that existed 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. This can go pretty deep, but for right now, the one thing I want to point out as I go through some of these, just a few. I mean, there's hundreds of facts we could go through about ancient Africa that most of us are never going to know unless we dig for this information ourselves. The one thing I want to point out is that even as the debate continues to go over the blackness of Kemet, or what was renamed Egypt, I think when we talk about African history, we do ourselves a huge disservice when we just focus on the great contributions of ancient Egyptians, because you find greatness throughout the African continent. And again, I ask this question: why is this covered up, invisibilized, or just not presented in our history textbooks? With the advent of the internet, this information is widely available now. And before people say, "Oh, well, you guys are just looking at this from that Afrocentric perspective," like, no. Now, for years, it's been Afrocentric scholars who've had to bring this information to the forefront, but increasingly, there are white, European, and other types of, let's say, experts, historians who are bringing this to the fore and saying, yeah, this is actually true. It's not just Black people wanting to bring Africa up and present a mythical Africa. Like, no, we have a lot of information about this that can be verified. So right now, I just want to talk about a few of those facts. Like I said, there's hundreds, if not thousands of facts we could go through, but I'm not going to go through that today. I'm just going to point out a couple of things courtesy of the Black History Studies website that talks a little bit about this history. One, Africans cultivated crops 12,000 years ago, the first known advances in agriculture. Africans pioneered basic arithmetic 25,000 years ago. Africans were the first to engage in mining 43,000 years ago. The medieval Nigerian city of Benin was built to a scale comparable to the Great Wall of China. In the Middle Ages, the Congolese were expert metallurgical artists. Some of the stuff that you find in like art, say in Nigeria and past in Benin, people are blown away today to see like, wow, how did they do this? Something that you really have to see. The Ethiopians minted their own coins over 1,500 years ago. In the first half of the millennium CE, Ethiopia was ranked as one of the world's greatest empires. And then that's another thing. When you go into African history, you find stories of all of these great African empires that we don't learn this stuff in school. As if, everybody in Africa was just living in huts. Right? They're all just living in dirt. It boggles the mind when you find out this hidden history. In southern Africa, there are at least 600 stone-built ruins in the regions of Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and South Africa. Evidence discovered in 1978 showed that East Africans were making steel for more than 1,500 years. Malian, people from the country of Mali, these were sailors who traveled to the Americas in 1311 AD, 181 years before Columbus. Everybody teaches us about Columbus, Pedro Cabral, Amerigo Vespucci. Why is it that we don't learn about the African explorers who crossed the Atlantic Ocean as well? As if that's impossible. I mean, the evidence is there. Mansa Musa, the 14th century emperor of Mali, is widely considered to be the wealthiest person in history, having a fortune that some estimate to be around $400 billion in today's money. $400 billion today's money. Why have we never heard of Mansa Musa? Why is there not a film or a documentary about this guy? Maybe there is a documentary. I'm going to have to look for that. But I'm just saying, this is another story from the past that everybody needs to know about. These are just a few of perhaps thousands of facts about ancient Africa that everyone should know, which brings me to this young lady here. This is Luana Safire. She has an online magazine called Revista Ebano. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. She is a social media influencer, creator of Ebano Brazil magazine. Now, take a look at the Ebano word. What word in English do you think you can translate that word into? It's not hard to tell. Speaking on this topic of why she created Ebano Brazil magazine online. So Safire answered the question this way. The Ebano Brazil project was born because my son suffered racism from another child. The worst phase for a Black child is school. Affirmative actions are the advance so that we can increasingly reach racial equality to leave a better world for our own kids. Okay, so this is again Luana Safire. Her project is called Ebano Brazil. If you haven't figured it out, Ebano is Portuguese for ebony. Where'd she get the idea for the term ebano or ebonium? That's probably not hard to tell too. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. Okay, so Luana Safire has appeared on a number of programs and done interviews. And I just want to share this post that she did. I don't know, it was a couple months ago. Like I said, I put it in an archive. So I'm going to get to this one day. So today is that day. So she asked in the short post, she says, do you have a striking memory of a teacher, something that stuck with you for a while? Something that stuck with you years after having this particular class or this particular teacher? I know there were times in my school history, things that happened in school that I'll just never forget. So then she goes on to write, I remember that in sixth grade, my history teacher, Manuel, told me to leave the classroom and then asked to be expelled from school because I corrected him in front of other students and told him that Blacks were not descendants of slaves and that being a slave was an inhumane condition or inhuman condition. I told him that there were kings and queens in Egypt and that was an affront to him. Other thing I want to point out about that is when Black people are depicted as slaves, it's like, okay, we have to correct that. Like, yes, Africans were enslaved, but they were not born slaves. It's like, okay, you guys were slaves. Like, no, we were African people who were enslaved. And it's intriguing to me how human bondage and slavery, servitude for other people has been going on for millennium. Why is it that it's only when they want to think about slaves, they just want to think about Black people? When you go back to ancient societies and see slaves all over the world, this is not one thing that uniquely happened to Africans. When you go back and you do the research, you're going to find slavery in almost every society around the world. Why is it that they want to present Africans that way? Because it is a psychological advantage to other people to be able to look at Africans and say, yeah, you guys are slaves. You guys are the inferior subjects in the world, when actually it is actually the opposite. When you uncover African history, it's like, wow, why is it that you don't want our people to know this stuff? Let me continue with what she was talking about. So she says, before becoming a pedagogue teacher, my mother was a maid and a nanny. For a while, she combined housework with being a child development assistant, the popular tia da creche, meaning the auntie in the nursery school. Oftentimes, when in Brazil, my kids went through nursery school in Brazil, and a lot of times the teachers in the nursery school, they won't be just necessarily known as professores or teachers. They'll be known as aunties. They'll be called chias. And it's almost like, if a Black woman is in a school, she's automatically going to be depicted this way. It's kind of like how can we say, it's a nickname. It's a way that kids can refer to these caretakers inside of the nursery school. It's an affectionate title to be called a chia or auntie in the school. She continues, when she worked in a family home, she was given a lot of things that her employers let go of, including expensive hardcover encyclopedias. Amongst this pile of books, I used to browse through them because I believe from an early age that if rich people had access to these books, there was something important in them. She mentioned encyclopedias, and I can remember very clearly as a child that my parents bought two sets of encyclopedias for me when I was a child. This is when we had those world encyclopedias that had like, 22, 24, 26 volumes, by letter A to Z. And then they had these two huge dictionaries. What I come to discover years later is that even though there's a lot of truth in those encyclopedias, there's also a lot of fiction. And to me, if you can go through an encyclopedia and find one thing that's not true, that says how much of the other stuff that we learn from those encyclopedias that are either half truths or complete lies. Not going to spend too much time talking about that, but that's something that I discovered years later. What else did Miss Luana have to say? She said, I spent my childhood and teenage years poring over these books, which had everything from enslaved Black people to the kings and queens of Egypt. There were women who were abused, and there were queens who ruled everything. So apparently what I learned from the elite books wasn't what my teacher taught. He insisted that Black people were only good at sports, music as percussionists, capoeira, and manual labor such as housework and construction. Listen to what this teacher was telling her. How many of us remember the scene in the Malcolm X film, directed by Spike Lee and starring Denzel Washington, when the child Malcolm was told by his teacher that, Malcolm dreamed of growing up to be a lawyer, and his teacher told him, like, no, you're a colored kid, you're Black, you're N-word, you could be a carpenter, work with your hands. So everybody has probably heard something like this from a teacher who either did it in an ill-mannered way or in a way that they didn't think was being discriminatory. Either way, that message gets passed on that says, well, you're Black. Let's think realistically of what you really can be. So this is the same thing that this woman is getting from her class, her teacher, and telling her what Black people are good for: sports, music and as percussionists, the martial art of capoeira, manual labor, housework, and construction. Right? This is a challenge that a lot of Black people all over the world have to get over. Like, no, this is not the role that we're given. This is the role that society wants to put us in, but it's up to us to be able to advance, get education, and then prove to the world what we can really be. That's the whole point here. And I'm reading through her recollection, like, dang, how many people went through this, right? She continues, then one day I asked him to speak and explain that all the things that I had mentioned, especially slavery, were not decent, but an imposed condition, and that many couldn't take and end up dying. Being a slave wasn't an option, it was an imposition. Now, the reason why that's important to me is because, as I've shown in numerous posts, numerous videos, Brazil as a whole continues to depict Black people as just being slaves. To this day, you still have people making jokes, people making, making just references to the past as if Black Brazilians are still slaves to this day. I did a story about this just a couple of days ago where this bartender made a YouTube video. Maybe it was on YouTube. I think it might have been maybe on Instagram, where he posted a video where he was talking about we should have never ended slavery. And I got numerous examples of this whole type of nostalgia that Brazil seems to have for the slavery era. So this is important for what she's talking about, because this is what even though she's talking about when she was a 12-year-old child, this is something that is still in the psyche of many Brazilians today. When they see Black people, they still see people who are slaves or descendants of slaves. So turning that erasing that mentality is one of the best ways that Black Brazilians can advance in society. It will improve self-esteem. It will open up a world of possibilities of what people can become. So this teacher asked if I wanted to know more than, no, this teacher asked if I wanted to know more than him. And I said, I thought I knew more. Then this man started Show da Xuxa. And I looked on, and it wasn't even debauchery. When people put on a show, I have a habit of just watching in silence, and it looks like debauchery. So what she's saying here is, she's talking about the Show da Xuxa. Let me see if I can find that up here. I've talked about this numerous times in videos. Show da Xuxa was a show by the popular television host Xuxa Meneghel. Right here is talking about Show da Xuxa in Wikipedia. It was a child's program that was hosted by Xuxa Meneghel. She's a Brazilian of German descent. Xuxa was huge in the mid 80s into the 90s with her shows. All of her shows, Show da Xuxa, Xuxa Show. She always had a show that was, it was made for children. You always saw what she called the baixinhas in the audience, the shorties. So Xuxa was a hero for the kids in Brazil. Any kid that grew up in the 80s and 90s in Brazil are going to remember the Show da Xuxa. Everybody loved Xuxa. The only thing about it was Shusha didn't have any black kids on that show. She didn't. There was a popular dance and song and dance female group on the show called the Paquitas. It was like, I don't know, 7, 8, 9, 10 blondes. You know, the way they would dress, they did their choreographed choreography and they sang songs. And every little girl growing up in Brazil wanted to be that. But black girls knew it wasn't possible because they never had a black Paquita. It's something, when you talk to black female celebrities today, many of them will tell you, I always dreamed of being a Paquita, but I couldn't because there were no black Paquitas. Why are there no black Paquitas? Okay. So show da Xuxa, something that every kid in Brazil knows about, particularly the girls, because it seemed like it was more oriented towards the girls. Anyway, so that's Show the Shusha. So this guy, the teacher wanted to change the subject, and I guess he turned on the Show the Shusha inside the classroom. I'm getting this is what she's saying, or she's saying that he was trying to change the subject because he wasn't accustomed to seeing a 12-year-old girl challenge him on what he was saying in front of the classroom. Anyway, Manuel freaked out because the students started laughing at him, who was squawking and dripping with laughter. Okay. So he's saying that the school, when she confronted the teacher about what he was saying about the role of black people and what you could and could not be, people, she said it was only like 4 or 5 black kids in the class, and people started laughing because they're like, damn, this 12-year-old black girl is checking this teacher. Unfortunately, he didn't want to give in and blame me for being the laughing stock of the class. And I just explained what I knew from the rich people's books. So I'm not sure if she's saying that the kids were laughing at him or they were laughing at her. I'm gonna have to go back and look at that. But what I'm getting is that this takes me back to another scene in a Malcolm X movie where Malcolm X confronted this Catholic priest over what Jesus Christ supposedly looked like. And people were like, man, you sure you want to take this guy on? But imagine a 12-year-old girl standing up and confronting the teacher and saying, look, don't, this is not how it should be. You're talking about black people as if we're only just the help. And that's far from the truth. So I admire this. I'm like, how many of you can remember witnessing a situation like this? Or how many of you can remember in school sometime where a teacher said something in front of the class and you felt humiliated because you were black? Think about it in your childhood, because I just remember there were times, and other girls have told me about times when they were in class where the teacher said something. I went to Catholic schools for part of my for my education. I always had white teachers. I never had a black teacher, during my time in those Catholic schools. And I don't ever remember them saying nothing just really just evil. Well, let me change that. In the first Catholic school I went to, it was a mixture of black and white teachers, but in the second Catholic school, it was all white teachers. And I don't think they did anything that was necessarily cruel, but at the same time, the exclusion of black people in history textbooks, for example, your silence is just kind of like you're accepting of this idea that black people did nothing in history. It was as if I had taken the shackles off the minds of the 5 black people in my class. And I was sure that a 12, 13-year-old preteen who had already had good diction because she had been forced to mature quickly due to being the eldest daughter, had a greater understanding of racial and social issues than he did. When I arrived at the board, I explained the situation and was congratulated. That's an incredible story that she told there. Just going back in her recollection as being a 12-year-old girl, where she had to check her, I would say, white teacher, even though she never specifically said that. But, from the way the history story is told, I would say she probably had a white teacher who was presenting history in that way. So I want to go through a couple of other links from the blackbraziltoday.com blog that kind of accentuates what I'm talking about with today's post. First of all, you go to just Google and the AI overview will tell you, I'm going to get it. I just mentioned some of the facts about ancient Africa, just a few of those facts, just to introduce the idea to people who've never heard this. But I thought this myself and I had it mixed up, but it says, no, the Great Wall of Zimbabwe is not 4 times larger than the Great Wall of China, but the walls of Benin are. The walls of Benin are thought to be 5,500 miles long, which is 4 times longer than the Great Wall of China. The walls were part of the Benin Empire, which was one of the oldest and most advanced states in Africa. The walls were described in the 1974 edition of the Guinness Book of Records as the world's largest earthworks made before the mechanical era. Ask yourself, why was this never taught in our history classes? Many Brazilian children and adults who recollect about their childhood will be able to relate to this article here. The worst moment of school was when they talked about slavery. I felt humiliated. The embarrassment of Black children in classes about slavery and abolition, because Black Brazilians are just minimalized in Brazil's history textbooks as if they were only slaves in history. I think it was the historian John Henry Clark who once said, like, look, you're starting behind. If you start Black history just from the point of slavery, then you already lost the game. I can't remember exactly how he said that, but that was basically the point. Actress Vanessa Oliveira, she records a video discussing racism she experienced as a child in school. The subject Brazil still doesn't like to take seriously. Let me see what else. Let me go on to another link here. Reflections on racism in the constructivist school of Laranjeiras. What else do we have? Black children are more punished than white students. Afro-Brazilian students face racism on the part of classmates as well as teachers. So not only do Black kids in Brazilian schools deal with the racism that they get from the teachers and the school system and students, but what I'm saying is that we face this type of racism because we're excluded from the textbooks. So when you present to the class, oh, you Black people were slaves, what does that say about how the white kids look at the Black kids from that point on? Ha ha, you guys were slaves. Who will protect the children in a racist society? 2 Black girls, 5 and 10, victims of racist insults in school. Little Black girl tormented by racist classmates, forced to apologize to her aggressors. Let me see what else we have here. Let me go on to another. Oh, I like this too. Dr. Petronilia Beatriz Gonçalves e Silva, racism expels the Black child from school. Numerous scholars in Brazil have said the first time that Black Brazilian children have to deal with racism is going to be in the school system. This is another great article from 2017, My Racist Professor or Racist Teacher. Hashtag exposes shocking recollections of racial discrimination experienced by Black students in schools and universities. Mil professora racista. So Black, young adults started this hashtag, back in 2017, where they were just having memories of some of the things that their teachers said in front of the class to humiliate Black people. Like, my racist professor, do these braids attract lice? Again, I've done a couple of videos where it's Black people who are thought to have lice in their hair. And a lot of people have come forward and says, no, it's not Black people who have lice, it's those other people. You go without washing your hair, tell your mother to straighten your hair, it looks prettier. This is one girl's recollection. Every time he spoke about slavery, he would point at me with this. The other students made jokes of the type, I'll put you on a whipping post and beat you until you become clean white. And the professor laughed, looking into my face, telling me to ignore it. This 1994 memory. This goes on and on. I see my pictures didn't come out. All of these, I have to go back. Maybe I will present this video, this article in a full video, because they broke down a lot of stuff here about the racism that they suffered in the Brazilian school system, okay? The name of that article was My Racist Professor or My Racist Teacher. Check that out. Now, I mentioned that the name of Luana Safire's online magazine is called Revista Ebano Brasil. And in the 1980s, there was actually another magazine in Brazil that was called Ebano. Okay, so it had a short run, but it was one of the first Black-oriented magazines in Brazil. Obviously, it had to have been influenced by, the United States Ebony magazine. So this is Revista Ebano from the 1980s. The Luana Safire website, online magazine, is the new version. She calls that one Revista Ebano Brasil. So I think she got the idea from this, which in turn probably got the idea from the American Ebony magazine. More. Okay, look at some of these stories here. 8-year-old boy with an afro has enrollment and refused at school because his hair doesn't fit the standard. Director denies racism. The veiled racism in schools. We need to talk about our Black children in these schools. When will Brazil address racism in its school? What else we have here? School is accused of racism after communicating that it requests students with straight hair for a presentation. So the Brazilian school system is fundamental in the reproduction of racism, and it goes on and on. This is why, we say over and over again, like, look, until Black people are directors of their own schools and the writers of their own history textbooks, this depiction of Black people as being inferior is going to always exist. So anyway, wanted to just bring this story to the fore because it just piqued my interest when Luana Safire talked about her memories of how her history teacher depicted Black people in front of the whole class, and how she must have felt and how 4 other Black students in that class must have felt. Anyway, what did you think about today's video? Drop a comment in the comment section. Do you have memories like this from school? When did you feel like When did you perceive for the first time, like, how come when I'm studying history in high school or even in, elementary school or college, how come we don't hear anything about the contributions of Africans in history? Share your comments in the comment section. Let's get this conversation started. Like this video, share this video, consider subscribing to the channel, click on the notification bell because I'll be putting up new videos soon. With that said, I'm going to end this video here and request that you all come back. Check out the next video that I post here at Black Brazil Today.